This is Harvard on the Map, presented by the Harvard Graduate School of Design, covering innovative ideas and thought leaders in digital cartography, Earth observation, and all things geospatial, with your host, Jennifer Horowitz.
Hello, and welcome to Harvard on the Map. I'm here with Alex Wellerstein. He's a historian of science at the Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey, who studies the history of nuclear weapons. He's also the creator of NUKEMAP. It's a pleasure to have you on the program.
A real pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, so I've got to say this is a lot of significance to me that NUKEMAP has been, in addition to being such an interesting application of geospatial visualization, has played an important role in my own personal life. My partner is a nuclear engineering PhD student, and that was one of the first things he sent me when he knew my interest was sort of in mapping. And so it's also the 10th anniversary of NUKEMAP. Is that what you told me?
Yeah, today exactly. Actually, yeah, wow. Coincidentally.
Amazing. So I have sort of 5 questions while I have my time with the Oracle, so to speak. So to start, study of nuclear weapons is unique among many STEM-related topics in that it's studied by a broad array of individuals across nuclear science and engineering, international relations, etc. So, given the varying levels of technical backgrounds, in addition to the sort of the newness to which many people approach, just the topic of nuclear weaponization, how do you think NUKEMAP provides a very different perspective, and how did the idea first come to be?
Well, first I would say that I have no real technical background when it comes to physics or math or anything like that. So that's sort of a disadvantage, but also an advantage, because if I'm going to understand something, it can't be in sort of the form of an equation. Like, it won't make any sense to me. And I have a bad time just visualizing numbers in general. So if somebody tells me, oh, that's 5 miles long, I either need to know that distance in my bones. So right now I know 5 miles is the bottom of Central Park to the bottom of Manhattan. And I've walked that. I can feel 5 miles now because I've done that and thought about, okay, this is 5 miles. But none of that stuff means that much to me intuitively. So as I was coming to the study of nuclear weapons, and you see lots of discussions of kilotons of TNT and megatons and scaling laws and this and that and blast pressure, I can understand sort of what it means, but I need more. I needed a way of seeing that literally. I needed a visualization. So NUKEMAP came out of initially my own desire to get a sense for the sizes of these different nuclear weapons in a way that was intuitive for me, even as a student, even before I was teaching, but certainly once I began sort of trying to teach other people. For example, there's a big debate in the 1950s between whether or not the United States government should make a hydrogen bomb. And some of the same people who thought that Hiroshima was an acceptable use of force said that they thought that the hydrogen bomb would only be a weapon of genocide, that this was too much. And if you don't know the difference between, say, 20 kilotons of TNT and 10 megatons of TNT, it's very easy to ask, and it's a fair question, like, why? Where's the line? Why does one of these genocidal and one of these is acceptable? But if you look at the kind of damage they do in a visual sense, you can see, okay, maybe you or I wouldn't draw the line where they draw the line, but you can see that this is orders of magnitude more damage. That one of these, like the Hiroshima bomb, you could imagine that being used in a relatively selective way. Whereas a 10 megaton bomb is just vast. It destroys suburbs. It destroys all metro areas, things like that. So I initially found some equations for this and this is before Google Maps even, used a really crude, this was a long time ago now, I think it was MapQuest, way of drawing these things. And I didn't show this to anybody. I used it to make diagrams that I might use in class or something like that. And then years later, I was looking at Google Maps again and the way in which you could draw things with that. And I realized, I could adapt this code that I made ages ago. That would be really trivial at this point. Why not do that? And so I did that and put it out there in the world. And it got way more usage and popularity than I ever expected when I put it out there. And then I felt a responsibility to make it better. So I spent a lot of time diving deeper into the models of effects and looking at what kinds of things I could do. And that's essentially what led to NUKEMAP being what it is today, where you can calculate, you can not only visualize the distances of these effects, but you could do it for bombs at different altitudes. You can look at fallout. You can look at the number of casualties potentially that might be there. You can do all sorts of stuff. That was sort of built on to the original idea once other people started using it, and I felt this responsibility to use it. So in terms of what does NUKEMAP do, for me, it helps me feel like the bomb and nuclear weapons effects are somewhat more personalized, that I can adapt them to spaces I already know, and thus they become sort of comprehensible to me in a real sense, not just a vague notion of destruction. And I like to think that that's what it helps other people do as well.
Well, thank you. It's such an interesting visualization. I've used it in many different ways to show how you can look at the impact of anything, whether it's a nuclear visualization or really any catastrophic effect. And I really love it. I've sent it to so many people, but it's so wonderful. It's also the 10th anniversary of NUKEMAP. So were you in your PhD when you released it? How did the working with these different collaborators to create it? You said you didn't have as much of a computational background. How did that come to be?
So I ended up doing it while I was on a postdoc. So this was actually right after I finished my PhD. And as probably a lot of people know, when you finish a PhD, you sort of cast around for a little while, figuring out who you're going to be next once you're not with your advisors in your home institution, and you're sort of coming into yourself. So I was in a period where I was trying to figure out how to be me. And one of those things that I was doing was I was blogging. I was starting to do sort of academic blogging, which was even by then not terribly in vogue. It was a little after the blogging way, but I thought, whatever, I'll just do it anyway. It's a way to sort of hoist my flag and say, here I am, and here's what I do. And one of the things that blogging makes you do is think about coming up with content. And this gave me an excuse to try different things. My postdoc was also very generous with, they basically let me do whatever I want. And so I could spend a week doing something like this. I actually built the first one without any collaborators. I mean, I'm not technical, but I know how to program. And so there's a fine difference there, that if programming is sort of a logical language, and I'm pretty good with logic and pretty good with language. Math I'm terrible with. So for me, it's always like trying to adapt the math to the code is needing to beat my head against the wall until I remember how to use an exponent again or something like that. Googling order of operations and all that kind of stuff. But if I have enough time, I can make it look the way it's supposed to look, and I can run it by people who know math much better than I do. So I actually built the whole thing originally. It took me like a weekend, and I just point that out to say I'm a pretty good. I think I'm an okay coder at this point, at least of somebody who, I don't always code in the most modern of practices, but of somebody who learned the code in the early 90s, I'm pretty decent at it. My students are sometimes impressed by my functions these days. I take a little pride in that because they're real coders. But I've been doing it since I was probably 12 years old. So it's the kind of thing that somebody who's been programming since they were 12 years old can do in a weekend, which is to say a real professional coder could probably have done it in a day. And somebody who's not a professional coder could probably have figured out how to do it in a couple of weeks or a month if they wanted to. It's not that hard. Some of the upgrades to NUKEMAP have been significantly difficult problems. And I have had some students and collaborators since then who have helped me do things like write really efficient database queries for really monstrous sorts of things. But most of what I do is in-house. I do it. It's one of the reasons it takes so long to add features. It's because if it's just me doing it in some time, it can take me a couple of years to work out. So one of the things NUKEMAP does now that it didn't do, you can do casualties for multiple nuclear weapons and it won't double count people dead. You can only kill people once. That's a really nasty database query to have to write. It took me probably 3 years to wrap my head around how that would be. Obviously, I'm not doing this full time for 3 years. I'm doing a million other things. But that's the kind of thing that I try to build up on it. But I'd like to use more collaborators, and I do have students help me explore these things. But ultimately, if I'm the one maintaining the code, I feel like I have to understand it all. And so I end up, whatever I have help from, I end up usually rewriting it in a way that makes sense to me, which sometimes is very clever, and sometimes would probably make computer programmers scream when they saw my hacky solutions to problems. But if it works, it works.
Yeah. Interesting. So I hadn't really even considered from the spatial database perspective. That must be very complex. You're dealing with all these different data sets. So what have been the upgrades since it was first launched? We mentioned a couple of things. What have those been? Yeah.
So one of them is, for example, is a fallout model, right? Fallout is actually a pretty tricky phenomena because you're talking about the byproducts of the nuclear explosion, how they're carried by the wind, and then how, based on the size of the byproducts, they're going to fall. So when they're going to fall, and then depending on that, that will change what levels of radiation it gets over time. So the way you go about doing this is first you have to find a model of fallout that will be adaptable to a web browser and to your visualization method. So there are a million different technical models that have been developed over the years by the United States government, by third-party contractors, by whoever. Some of those are the kind of thing that you can run in a web browser. Some of them, it'll take you an hour to get a result. Nobody wants that, right? So I had to go through a lot of different models and try to find one that would look like people sort of expected it to, be flexible to what I wanted. So I'd need to be able to put in different yields of weapons and different altitudes and different amounts of fission versus fusion. All these things affect what you're going to see. And it needs to spit out results that then I could use and do it relatively quickly. You know, should take less than a second to get the result. So finding the model is step number one, and requires a lot of compromises, because if you want a really high fidelity simulation, you're not going to be able to do that in your web browser. And on the other hand, something that's too simple, it just draws a big oval, that doesn't really get you very much either. So finding something that's in between, I've sort of picked up over the years an attention to what's that in between space for good for web stuff. And then you have to code the whole thing, which is not only recoding all the math, which is non-trivial for the model. And it turns out one of these models, the model I use is from the 1960s and was published in a journal. And so I had to get a copy of it. Of course, the copy I had really bad scans. So some of the numbers you couldn't see. I actually had to go to the National Institutes of Health library to find a physical copy in order to get like some of the numbers. And then it turned out in some of the equations, they had made typos, which of course you don't see until you actually try to reproduce the whole thing, which probably nobody ever did. And so I did this whole reproduction, found that it was getting wrong numbers, and then realized that, oh, there's a decimal point shifted here. If I shift this one decimal point, it all aligns with the data as it should be. So you then have to get it into the code, which is JavaScript in this case. And then you have to build the interface between like the numbers it spits out. It's just going to spit out coordinates or something, and the visualization software, which is known as the API, the Application Programming Interface. Originally, this was Google Maps. Now it's Mapbox, because they don't charge me as much as Google Maps. And so this is the sort of, I just lay it out like this so you can get a sense of the different steps of how you break it into chunks. Of the sort of conceptual, the programming, and then the sort of visualization. These are each sort of three different places that all have to go together. And it's one of the parts that makes this, I find, really fun, but it's also a tricky skill that's a little different from sort of both what the scientists do, which is like pure data, and also what people who are maybe more in just graphic design do, which is pure visualization. I have to look for these bridges between these worlds and make a lot of compromises as well. The other feature that I'm quite proud of, the casualty estimator, this is another case where it's like, okay, how would you go about doing this? Well, you get a model, and I have some very crude numbers from the US government, which basically that they developed in the 70s, sort of rules of thumb that if you're within this much blast pressure as a proxy for the overall explosive power, then, 90% people die, 28% are injured, and 2% live, or something like that, right? It's these percentages. And then you have to go through with NUKEMAP and find those blast radiuses. That's easy to do. That's what it does sort of by default. But then you have to figure out how many people are within those blast radii. And so there's a database that I was able to license from the US government called Landscan, which is a sort of gridded database of latitudes and longitudes. And I think it's 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer grid of the whole world. And it's sort of just a model estimate of what they call ambient population density. So it's how many people are likely to be in this 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer square over the course of a 24-hour period. And that arrives in some awful GIS file, which is not something that a web browser or computer script can use. So then I had to figure out how to export that into something that could then be uploaded into a MySQL database, which is much more what like web development is going to use. And then figure out the queries that allow me to say very quickly, get me the number of people who are within this radius of this point. And then you add some additional complexity because 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer is pretty chunky, but that line is going to cross half of kilometers. And for small nuclear weapons, they might only hit 2 of those grid cells or something. So I came up with a kind of anti-aliasing. This is all a database query. And again, this is from somebody who does not really know any math. So this is the kind of stuff I do during meetings when I was, I'd be in a meeting and I'd be doing geometry on and sort of relearning, figuring out how to express this in a way that I could make this really nasty database query that I could then run and then have that database query run in a fraction of a second, which fortunately some people on Stack Overflow website where you can ask computer people for help, they help me reformulate this query so that it's pretty fast, and then I do a lot of caching. And so this is the kind of, again, it's visualization, but it's also database programming, but it's also a lot of other things going on at once. And it's taken me a while to get into this. I like it a lot. Now that I'm in it, I find it's really powerful. But it's really different than a lot of typical GIS work. There's also no interface. All of this is pure code that then I'm translating into these application programming interfaces so that you can see them. But it's not like I can drag a thing. It's all coding.
Fascinating. I wondered on the Mapbox API piece, you mentioned that you moved from Google Maps visualization piece to the Mapbox. As someone who's a big Mapbox fan, I wonder, was that an easy transition, or was that was it more of just a cost conscious choice? I mean, was that
So it was initially 100% cost driven because Google Maps went from being free to being trivial to being prohibitively expensive. And part of that is they're changing their pricing structure over the last 10 years. Part of that is also the number of people using NUKEMAP. So I went into a category where, NUKEMAP can get gets a minimum of about 10,000 users a day. And that's on a slow day. And on a big day, it can get 100,000 users, 200,000. That's pretty much what my server caps out at. And so that puts you in a category of Google Maps where you're talking about thousands of dollars per month for map views alone. And I fortunately have some people who are willing to support me, but they're not willing to support me to the tune of, $50,000 a year for a website. So Mapbox is willing to work with me on this, and they give me a pretty steep discount. It still costs, I don't know, $600 a month or something like that. But I've been able to find people who've been over the years who've been willing to pay that, because obviously I don't pay that out of pocket. In terms of the moving over, there were some parts that were relatively easy. What I use, Mapbox is the tile server, so it's giving me the map data. And there's another layer on top of that, which is the sort of interface. And I use Leaflet for that. And Google Maps does both of these things. But I found Leaflet to be, I could code my functions so that they were basically agnostic about what kind of, if I said make a marker, I have it detect, is it Leaflet or is it Google Maps, and then drop in the code either way. And they are a little different, but not a big deal. The hardest difficulty is that Leaflet is not by default, it's not meant for large scales of visualization. So their circles are not great circles, right? They are pure circles that don't take into account latitude or the curvature of the earth. But there are lots of things with NUKEMAP where actually the curvature of the earth plays. You're talking about circles that are large enough that it matters. And so I had to write my own subclass of Leaflet to do great circle mapping and things like that. And it's available on the Leaflet plugin. You can get the Alex Wellerstein draw a real circle, draw a real stuff, because otherwise it won't work for these kinds of applications. So that was pretty good. The only difficulties have been that Mapbox has been, they really want to use a more efficient, I think they call it Mapbox GL, which uses your graphics card. And it doesn't have all of the functions that some of the 2D stuff had. And so I've had to use some sort of hacky ways to make it, essentially it looks the same as it always has, but there's actually some hacky things in there. Because, for example, Mapbox GL by default wants you to be able to zoom sort of discreetly into, infinite variation between zooms. But Leaflet doesn't want you to do that. It wants it to be set zoom levels. And so there's sort of hacky plugins that adopt it over. But at the moment, it basically works. So I'm pleased with it. So I'm happy with it. But it wasn't like the simplest transition, but it probably took me 2 weeks to work it over, which by my standards is not a big deal. So it didn't take a year. So that's fine.
Well, it's so wonderful that you're also doing this because of your own personal interest, but it's become this. I had no idea how many views you get even in a given day. That's amazing. Wow. I wonder what the reception has been. If there's been interesting responses to NUKEMAP that you know that were surprising or notable that you since it's released 10 years ago.
I've gotten all sorts of responses. The total number of users globally is something like 30 million over time. The number of detonations is I just tallied them all up since it's the 10th anniversary, is about 219 million. So people are setting off more than one bomb. And according to Google Analytics, it's people in literally every country in the world, including North Korea, have used NUKEMAP, which I find kind of amazing and slightly improbable, but that's really great. In terms of response, I get all sorts of responses. I've had a lot of people. The most common response that I see in person and also online when I look at how people talk about it on Twitter or Reddit or something like that is, oh, this is scary and it's fun. And I think that's an interesting combination, fun and scary, kind of like a roller coaster or something like that, right? That's a potent place. I get a lot of people saying that the most common sort of substantive response is along the lines of, these aren't quite as powerful as I thought they were, which is true. Most people imagine a nuclear weapon goes off and like the whole world ends. And NUKEMAP shows you, no, it's a localized phenomena. It can be massive, localized to the entire New York City metro area, right? Or a fallout plume that covers the entire Northeast or something, but it's not like the whole world going up in smoke. And that's been an interesting experience because occasionally you get people say, oh, this is not even a big deal. That's rarer. That's people using the tiniest of nukes on the options. But usually I think of it as a form of almost like calibration of expectations, right? So people are looking at it, expecting the whole world to die, and then saying, oh no, it's just really awful, which I actually think is probably better for our ways of thinking about it as a culture. When you think of it as like the whole world dies, nukes go off and the world fades to white and then fades to black, like in the movies or something, right? Then it becomes this sort of unmanageable concept. And people shunt it into the part of their brain where they put other unmanageable concepts, like their own mortality, right? Everybody knows about it. Nobody wants to think about it, right? So it's not something you're usually dealing with on a daily basis, even though you know it's kind of out there. Whereas if you shrink that scale a bit and you see, oh my God, that would just be miserable and awful, it's a level, and there would be a lot of survivors, right? Even the worst nuclear attack scenarios against like the United States during the Cold War, you still have, I don't know, 40, 50% people surviving. So the odds are pretty high that you're going to be a survivor and then have to deal with the consequences. And that's a really different way to think about nuclear weapons than I just die, right? Everybody would just die. And this is become a bigger theme of my career since doing NUKEMAP and talking with people about this and realizing that most people don't take nuclear weapons seriously because they think that if they were used, they would just die. And again, you just shunt that into the part of your brain that doesn't think about death. Whereas you instead start thinking about it as, okay, what if my town was depopulated by 50%? What if half of my friends were dead? What if half of my family were dead? How would I feel about that? And that really hits a lot harder. That has an emotional resonance. So there used to be a feature when it was on Google, because I could do this data with Google. Google's API has a feature where you can like look for local businesses, right? You can say like, oh, how many pizza places are there within 5 miles? But you can use that for all sorts of different purposes at pizza places. So there used to be what I called a humanitarian impact button, where it would show you how many schools would be destroyed by the nuclear weapon, how many hospitals would be destroyed by the nuclear weapon, how many places of worship would be destroyed by the nuclear weapon. And that's just stunning when you think about, okay, you see a circle on the map, you don't know how many schools are in there, but that's the experience of like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They used schools to calculate the death rate because they had attendance records, right? Like they could do that kind of thing. And that's the kind of thing that hits you right in the gut. And this was somebody actually suggested to me early on, like, oh, what if you could calculate humanitarian impact? It's a great idea. And I haven't figured out a good way to adapt that to Mapbox yet, just because the feature is it's a tricky feature to adapt to this, but that's the sort of thing I'm always looking for, which is what's another way to make these things more personalized and less abstract. My biggest issue with NUKEMAP, and sometimes people have expressed this to me very politely. If you're just looking at it as rings on a map from the sky, that's basically the same way that a nuclear war planner looks at it. It's not how a victim looks at it. It's not how a civilian looks at it. And so finding ways to bridge that gap, this is partially why I developed the casualty estimator, things like that. That's been a big challenge for me to be able to bridge that, because I think it's a really important conceptual gap, because you don't want people looking at this the way that the war planners do. You want it to be a bit more of a richer and human experience than that.
Fair. So interesting how it's definitely difficult to conceptualize a nuclear attack. And that's interesting, even thinking about other, catastrophic events, whether that's, the Holocaust or forward thinking events like global warming. And that's a very, I hadn't thought about that. I have too many questions for you, and I could take your whole day, but I won't. I have just one more question before the final one. I find the points you've raised about the data processing issues are so interesting. I do a lot of data science projects. I'm always looking for interesting data sets. And last night I was working on a project using UFO sightings data, and there was an extra space after the longitude numbers, and it probably kept me up for 4 more hours, because that one little space on the longitude value just messed everything up. But finally I got these UFO sightings to work. But I wondered if you have any tips and tricks in terms of data cleaning, and also which data sets you recommend in terms of visualizing further nuclear projects. I loved I saw Plan A, and that was another sort of nuclear related geospatial visualization. Such an interesting one too. I'd love to ask about that, and then also in terms of your tips and tricks in terms of data processing.
Sure. Plan A was really fun. Plan A is these people I know at Princeton. They have a science and global securities program there. And I've talked with them over the years. We're not that far from each other. We have a lot of overlapping interest. And they had emailed me one day and said, "Oh, how hard would it be to make a visualization of this attack?" And I said, "It'd be easy. I could write this code. Really, it'd take me a couple of days." So it was not just the visualization, but it's actually like an engine to visualize any attack. And you plug in a bunch of Excel spreadsheets, essentially. I made them make the Excel spreadsheets. I don't want to guess where the attack is. But if you give me a bunch of latitudes and longitudes and timing, and is it a sub, is it a this, I then have a little code that just reads all that data and plays it in the browser, and then you make a movie of the browser. And I find that quite fun. I do a lot of browser-based stuff. I find that that's a little anomalous when it comes to data viz people these days. They often want to use sort of like special software, whether it's ArcGIS, whether it's R or something like that. But I like using web browsers, both because they're increasingly powerful. They're capable of doing quite a lot these days, especially if you use the graphics card functions. That you can do really bizarre, interesting stuff with them. But also they're open to such a big audience. The real interesting thing about web development, web visualizations, one, huge audience potential, right? You don't have to download software. You don't have to have a special kind of machine or anything like that. Two, they're sort of built for interactivity. So Plan A is just a video, whereas I'm more interested in making things that would allow you to change the parameters and see what would happen. What would the outcome be if this didn't happen or that did happen? That's all the kind of stuff that you can do with a web program very easily. And that encourages a lot of this engaged learning in which people are teaching themselves. And so NUKEMAP doesn't tell you what to do, right? It doesn't tell you which weapon. It doesn't say be afraid. It doesn't tell you anything. All it says is select a bomb and pick a place, and then people play with it. And I use play in a sort of technical term where they're trying things out. And they're doing more than one detonation. And if you look at the logs of like what people do, they go to like in the middle, they go to the big, they go to the small, they like try out a bunch of different things. They try them on different places. They're calibrating themselves without being lectured at, without being told what the emotional import is. Some of them take away really different views politically than I would take away, but that's their prerogative, right? Like that's up to them. one of the consequences of this is that NUKEMAP is essentially nonpartisan. I mean, it's been used, it's been on the Daily Show, and it's also been on Breitbart and Fox News. And I don't love Breitbart and Fox News, but the fact that like Newt Gingrich has cited NUKEMAP is crazy to me, given that I'm probably about as far from Newt Gingrich's politics as you can imagine. But and in this weird world, this seems to be the kind of thing where we can actually come to at least some factual agreement about the weapons effects. So I think that there's a role for that. I think if I were giving further advice to people, it would be along these lines. One, look for things that you can make interactive, because interactivity changes everything. It's one thing to make a beautiful visualization. It's another to make a visualization that people can manipulate. And I don't just mean, sometimes it just means showing you different data, and that's a useful way of manipulation. But my favorite are what I call model visualizations, which is what NUKEMAP is. And this is where you're building a code model that allows you to tweak variables, and then the user can manipulate those variables. And that is so much more interesting to me in many ways than a lot of typical data visualization. And then go together, right? The NUKEMAP casualty is using the static data set of people, but then allowing you to manipulate where the nukes go off and see how that changes the outcome. It's a different way of thinking about it than data than I think a lot of people do. It's also, you end up having to think a lot about like what's a good model and where are the places where I have to cut corners to make this work. And all models cut corners, obviously. A web browser imposes some corner cutting based on its performance capabilities and things like that. But I find that extremely interesting. And I've played with some other models and model sets, and none that I felt got where I would want to put them into the world, but things like asteroids and pandemics and things like that. I feel like this is an area where there's a tremendous amount of opportunity for growth across fields. And every once in a while, we see these things with sea level rise calculators and things like that. But this is the place that if I were recommending people look more deeply, it's not as hard as it looks. Either if an individual can do it, and I'm an individual, I can do some of this stuff. Even if I'm an exceptional individual, and I don't know if I am or not, it means that a team of individuals could also do it, right? Like this is the kind of thing where small groups of people there's so many models out there, there's so much data out there, finding ways to make it so that people can experience it and personalize it themselves by making it interactive. I think that's tremendously powerful. So to me, that's where I would go if I were looking towards future horizons in any field, especially in things like climate, especially in things like pandemics, et cetera.
Well, thank you. That's fantastic advice. Final question for you now. I know I'm running over time. So okay, I'm glad. Thank you for your time. So finally, I ask all of my interviewees this. So if you could describe a time where you were lost, whether that could be physically or metaphorically speaking in your life or career, and how you found your way back again.
So I'll give you a physically lost story that I think about a lot over the years. So this is the first year I was in graduate school. I'm from California originally. I had not really traveled that much outside of California prior to going to graduate school at Harvard. And so I had moved across the country. I'm in the Northeast for the first time. I don't really know the East Coast. I didn't have a feel for it. But I went to my first conference. The first conference was in Athens, Georgia, right? At the University of Georgia. And this was before Google Maps, I think, or maybe, I don't know, maybe I was just a moron. I guess I was a moron, but I don't know. I just booked a ticket to Athens, Georgia on an airplane. And that is not what you do, because Athens, Georgia has an airport that's the size of a bus station, right? It's a tiny little regional airport. And what you do is you fly to Atlanta and then you take a car to Athens. It's like an hour away or something like that. But I didn't know that. So I booked this plane flight where I go from Boston to Atlanta and then from Atlanta to Athens on this tiny plane, which has like 6 people on it. And we're, of course, in like a thunderstorm and it's rocking and it's terrible. And anyway, you get there. It's this tiny airport where the guy who unloads your bags is also the guy who rents you your car, who's also the guy who checks your ticket, right? It's one of these little regional places. Fine. I get there. I rent a car. I go to my conference. I have a very nice time. It was great. And then I've got to go home. I'm trying to go home to return this car. I'm trying to go back to this airport and it's foggy and I cannot find the airport. And I don't have this is before smartphones. I have like a crude printout map of where the airport is supposed to be. And I'm just like driving, clearly driving in circles around it. And I can't find the entrance. And it's so foggy that I can't really tell where I am. I can kind of see a control tower in the distance. So I know I'm near it. And I can't find the airport. And finally, I like stop and ask directions. And I get these kind of like very rural directions. I'll turn right at the cow and then left at the yellow house. But it worked. And I finally get to the airport with these rural directions. But by the time I get there, the plane is left. I've missed the only flight because, of course, no other flights are going. It's going to Atlanta. And the guy who's supposed to take my car back isn't there. So I'm stuck at this airport, no idea when the next flight is. There's nobody there. And I can't return this rental car. And I have to make this decision of like, what do I do next? And so I decide at the moment, I'm going to drive to Atlanta in this rental car. I can catch the connecting flight back to Boston there because I've got like an hour and a half. It's about an hour drive. So I don't have a lot of wiggle room, but I can probably do it. And I'll convince them to take the car back, even though I'm returning it to the wrong airport, which they do not like. They usually charge you a lot of money for. But I'm going to do this. And so I don't have a map. All I have is a crude like handout from the car rental place, which has like the major freeways on it. And it's like one of those, like, it's like 4 freeways and then like a star for Atlanta in the center. And I kind of know where I am. So I'm like, all right, I can follow signs. Atlanta's a big city. There's got to be signs to the airport, right? So I just head out on the road, really not knowing where I'm going or how to get there. And I do pretty well, right? I can follow signs towards the Atlanta direction, but at some point the freeways get pretty complicated around there. And I don't really know which I should be on to get to the airport. So I pull over to a fast food place and I go inside and I ask the people there, where am I on this map? And they have no idea what I'm asking them. They are totally confused by the question. And I realize I'm like explaining to them what a map is. I'm like, well, okay, imagine we were in the air looking down and these are the only roads we can see. It's a 2-dimensional. And they had clearly just didn't have map literacy in any significant way. They were completely confused by this map. They had no idea which way was which. They clearly knew how to get to work, but they didn't navigate through maps. And they were essentially useless, and I had to just sort of guess. And I was right, and I returned the car. It was fine. I got back. It was great. Great story. But the takeaway I took from it, aside from don't fly into regional airports, was at least pre-smartphone, I suspect you had a much higher level of map illiteracy than I think most educated people realize. And I had never thought of that before, that you would not know how to use a map. But of course, there are people who would not know how to use a map. We all had to be taught to use a map, and there's some of us who can use maps better than others. I find maps very intuitive. I know people who find them very unintuitive and have a hard time figuring out where you're supposed to go next and things like that. And it made me think about later how smartphones probably have changed that to some degree for both better and worse. People are super used to Google Maps at this point, right? Who doesn't know how to use the Maps app on their phone? But on the other hand, we also lament that people have lost local knowledge about where to go. If you only use GPS, you never develop that instinctive feel of where certain roads lead and how the compass coordinates line up and things like that. So anyway, that's the interesting takeaway from a Shaggy Dog story, which was to think about that I had never been confronted with the possibility that somebody wouldn't understand a map. And to be fair, it wasn't a very good map, but and I actually met several people that day who clearly that wasn't how they thought about space.
Interesting. And so relevant given how many, I feel like even people, my contemporaries, don't know directions to a place they go all of the time because they're so attached to their Apple Maps or Google Maps and their phone. And so that was a great story. Thank you. Thanks for being on the program.